Our next round of FAMM is starting soon. Are you ready to elevate your women's health practice? To have the tools to support your clients with menstrual cycle issues, including irregular cycles, hormone imbalances, abnormal bleeding, period pain, and other similar situations? Are you ready to gain the skills to teach fertility awareness to your clients and have the tools to interpret even the most complex menstrual cycle charts? That's where our Fertility Awareness Mastery mentorship comes in. Join the waiting list to be notified when registration opens before anyone else. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAMWL to join the waiting list today. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMWL. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 560. Today, I'm sharing a brand new episode in my FAMM research series. Today's episode is all about HA and the role of fat intake in your missing period. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into today's episode. So we're going to be diving into a study today that really assessed the difference in macronutrient intake between a group of women who were cycling normally and a group of women who had lost their periods. What's interesting about this study is they did match these groups fairly well in terms of their body mass index and, generally speaking. So the women kind of looked very similar weight, and they wanted to kind of look deeper into the nutritional intake of these women to see if there were differences there. Because typically you might think that it's all about calories. And as long as you're getting, quote, enough calories based on our preconceived notions of what enough would be, that your period should just magically return. But this study gives us a significant insight into what really could be going on there and the role of macronutrient intake specifically in terms of how it could relate to getting your period back. So a few things that are really interesting about the study. One of the things is how they talked about the definitions of HA. So if you've dove into some of the HA research or if you've read some of my writing on this topic, so in the 5th vital sign and also in the HA chapter of Real Food for Fertility, I go in and kind of explain how HA is defined. So the technical term for HA is functional hypothalamic amenorrhea. And it occurs essentially when a woman has not had her period for 6 months or more, when she previously did have a period, and other conditions have been ruled out. So whether it's other medical or health conditions or any of those kind of other reasons have been ruled out. The typical causes of HA are thought to be a combination of exercise, undereating, and stress. But how they have it defined in the research literature is weight loss related, exercise related, and stress related. So typically they're looking at women who have a significant reduction in their weight due to undereating, women who are exercising quite a bit and obviously not consuming enough food to offset that energy output. And then stress, they have as its own category. And one of the things that I've always found interesting about the stress category is how this plays out in real life is not that stress by itself is solely responsible for you not having a period. If you're going through a stressful time in life, or if a stressful event occurs, or you have regular stress that's happening on a daily basis, what I have observed is that stress, if you think about it, when was the last time you were under a lot of stress? And would that be the time that you were following all of your routines when you're super stressed? Is that when you're eating really well? Is that when you're sleeping really well and really prioritizing yourself? Typically not. So I've always found it just in practice that stress category is not the sole factor. It certainly plays a role. And obviously stress itself can have a disruptive effect on our HPA axis. But I have found that it's not simply stress by itself. So I thought it was really interesting how the researchers defined it and talked about it, because basically they were saying in the study that, well, if it's not due to weight loss and if it's not due to exercise, it's long been thought that it's more of like a psychological issue, whether it be the specific way that these women are responding to stress or just the stress itself having this negative effect. So one of the reasons that the researchers did this study to really look at the nutritional intake and how it could impact the cycle was because of their kind of like, why is this happening? It has to be related to the way that it was worded gives the impression that it's kind of like, it's got to be in her head. It's so interesting when you read like lots of research papers because you get a lot of insight as to why life is the way it is for so many of us. But basically, there's kind of that idea like, oh, it's got to be this totally psychosocial, psychological issue, when I've always found it to be more of a practical issue, especially with HA. So let me share a little bit about the study and some of the aspects that they were testing, some of the specific pieces that they were testing. So as I mentioned, the women who were in the study, they did have a similar body mass composition. So they made sure that they had women who were kind of similar, except one had a period and one did not have a period. And they excluded women who had overt eating disorders. So if they had been assessed to have an eating disorder, such as anorexia or bulimia, they were excluded from the study. They also excluded women from the study who had primary amenorrhea. So the difference between primary is that in primary amenorrhea, these women have never had a natural cycle. So all the women in the study at some point had periods, and now they did not have periods anymore. They also assessed a few different scales. They used questionnaires and standardized assessment tools to assess where these women were on the eating disorder scale. So although, like I said, they excluded women who specifically had, overt eating disorders, they still had these women fill out this questionnaire so they could assess where they were. So they screened these women with the Beck depression test as well as the eating disorder inventory to compare the women who were cycling naturally with the women who had not had a period for 6 months or more. They also tested the body composition. So when these women came into the kind of clinical space for the study, they had specific ways to test their body composition so that they can see the percentage of fat and all of those things to compare the participants. And they also tested their hormone levels specifically to see if there was a difference between the hormone levels of the women who were cycling versus who were not. And they also had the women. So what's interesting too is when you look at the study, they had these women come to this location. They had food options for them to consume. And they even had each participant, work with a nutritionist to kind of outline give them some suggestions on how to organize their meals. But ultimately, it was a bit of a controlled environment. They had the women journal and write down what they were consuming. And they also had a specific way of assessing and measuring what was the caloric intake of the foods that they were consuming. So just picture you go to this place and they have this food there for you. They put it out at certain times of day. So they're giving you breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And they don't give you a tray like with food in it. Like they have the food out, but you decide what you're going to put in your plate, but they still give you some suggestions or recommendations for what to eat. So this is relevant when we get to the results, because I think that makes the results more compelling even. So unsurprisingly, the women who were not cycling normally, so the women who had not had a period for 6 months or more, their hormone levels were not balanced, not comparable. So they measured luteinizing hormone, prolactin. They measured a few different estrogens, estrone and estradiol, and they even measured sex hormone binding globulin. But the women who were not cycling had lower hormone levels compared to women who were cycling. And, this isn't necessarily a surprise because the women who are not cycling, there's no ovulatory action. There's no follicular development. So we make our estrogen as our follicles develop and grow as we approach ovulation. So if there's no ovulation, we're not making that. They didn't test progesterone levels, but although HA in the research literature is defined as like a low estrogenic state, because of course you're not ovulating, so you're not moving towards that ovulation. Your follicles are not developing, and you're not making estrogen, but you're also not making progesterone when you're not cycling, because we only make significant amounts of progesterone after ovulation. So either way, unsurprisingly, the women who were not cycling did not have sufficient hormone levels, and they were much lower compared to the control group. When they reported the results of these screening tests, so the eating disorder inventory test and the Beck depression test, the women, although there were no women who were chosen for the study that had overt eating disorders, their scores on the eating disorder inventory were 3 times higher than the scores of the control group, the normally cycling women. And the women who were not cycling also scored higher on the depression test. So this introduces the idea of the HA spectrum. I always talk about this concept of the HA spectrum. So Lily and I talk about this spectrum idea in the HA chapter of Real Food for Fertility. I think it's a really important concept, whether you yourself are struggling to get your period back, or this was something that you used to struggle with and you have since had your period return, or whether you're a clinician and you're working with patients who are kind of maybe somewhere on the spectrum. So just to introduce the idea of the spectrum concept, there's women on the end of the spectrum who haven't had a period, let's say even for years. So the kind of overt cases of HA. And on the other side of the spectrum, I would say that there are women who are cycling, but they exude some of these behaviors, whether it's under eating or, as we'll get into, the macronutrient ratio is really, really off, skewed in the wrong direction, or they do have a significant kind of exercise habit and they're not underfueling enough to not have a period, but they're underfueling enough to not have optimal hormone balance and you can potentially start to see signs of this in their cycle. So I would argue that on that spectrum, it's not just whether you have your period or not. You can be on the HA spectrum when you are cycling, when you're still underfueling, not enough to not get a period, but underfueling enough not to have an optimal hormone balance and to see some level of cycle disruption, especially when you're charting your cycle. So again, the fact that these women scored higher on the eating disorder inventory, they went into some of the categories and the questions that they were asked. And one of the aspects of the disorder inventory was this drive for thinness. This is a topic that comes into play a lot. It's something that I've read a lot about. Anytime you're diving into the HA literature, you see a lot of these kind of issues. And so on that HA spectrum, it's characterized typically by a desire to not gain weight. I mean, hello, the whole thing is that you're not eating enough, right? Like that's a big piece of it. Whether it's exercise related, weight loss related, or stress related, there is some degree of undernourishment happening to prevent your body from having the tools it needs to make hormones and to allow you to have a period. So we see this wanting to be thin, as well as the fear of gaining weight, as being kind of themes among women who fall into this HA spectrum idea. And there are women who have largely recovered from the most overt piece of that, but still struggle with the fear of gaining weight. And so still restrict categories to some extent. Even if it's not enough to not cycle, it can still cause some issues, cycle irregularities, things like that. So to move on, they also tested the body composition of the women to compare. And like I said, they kind of matched them for body mass, but the women who were cycling normally had a higher percent body fat compared to the women who were not. And again, that's not surprising. So there's no magical number in terms of you need to have this exact percent body fat to cycle. So everyone is not the same. And there is certainly a range. But when you look at groups of women who have their periods regularly versus women who are not cycling at all, it is not uncommon in the research. It's pretty much across the board that you will see a higher overall percentage body fat in the women who are cycling normally. So this is a known thing. And so it's not surprising that the women who are not cycling had a lower percent body fat, even though they generally had similar body mass. So what was also a compelling result, now we're getting to the meat of it, pardon the pun, but in the study results, both participants, whether they were cycling normally or not, had a similar overall caloric intake. So when they looked at the calories, the women were eating similar calories, But the women who were not cycling, they were found to consume 50% less fat. 50%. So they were eating half as much fat, and they compensated for this by eating more carbs. So they had a higher fiber intake, lower fat intake, similar protein intake. And that was the main difference. Calories were the same. So this is a really important piece to pay attention to. And I think it answers a lot of questions in the general HA space, where if we're only focusing on calories, you may have women who are kind of forcing themselves to eat more calories. But what are they choosing? What are they choosing to eat, right? They're choosing to eat, well, carbs, basically, and processed foods. And they're not there, but they're specifically reducing their fat intake. So if you think about, again, the kind of psychology around HA, and as I mentioned, this desire to be thin, and I'm not saying everyone's the same across the board, but this is a general theme for sure within the HA space, where there's a desire to be thin and there's a focus on calories, because of course the idea is that if you eat less calories, that you're not going to get fat, right? And so what has the most calories? I mean, it's simple math. It's if you're looking at the caloric composition of food, fat has the most calories. So logically, if this is how you're thinking, if you're thinking, okay, I want to lose weight, I want to eat less calories, you're going to try to eat as many of those quote empty calories as you can, and reduce the fat calories as much as possible to kind of lower the overall caloric intake, right? Because basically to get up those calories, you could probably eat more carbs, whereas the fat calories add up faster. So none of this is really surprising when you think about it, but it's very compelling when the research is presented in this way, because it gives the answer to the question of, I've been eating X number of calories. This is a lot of calories. Maybe this is the most calories I've ever eaten in my life, but I still don't have my period back. What's going on? And we really have to look beyond just calories and look at the quality of what you're eating, the quality of the food. And this study highlights that we also have to look at the macronutrient ratio and think about it more than just calories in, calories out. You're not a car and food is not gas. In order to support optimal hormone production, it's not simply just eating more carbs, because we literally, so a silly example would be, how do you make coffee without coffee beans? In order to make coffee, you need the coffee beans, right? So if you're trying to make hormones, well, what do you need to make hormones? Well, we know that our main steroid hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, cortisol, even vitamin D, are synthesized from cholesterol, which comes from animal fat. And so what we see is when I'm working with women who are struggling to balance their hormones, when their cycles are out of whack, when we really focus on balancing those macros, getting sufficient protein and fat specifically, we see a significant improvement in overall hormone health and an overall hormone balance and menstrual cycle regularity. Jumping in to today's episode with some exciting news. Our next round of FAMM is starting soon. Are you ready to elevate your women's health practice? To have the tools to support your clients with menstrual cycle issues, including irregular cycles, hormone imbalances, abnormal bleeding, period pain, and other similar situations? Are you ready to gain the skills to teach fertility awareness to your clients and have the tools to interpret even the most complex menstrual cycle charts? That's where our Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship comes in. Join the waiting list now to be notified when registration opens up again before everyone else. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/FAMMWL. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMWL to join the waiting list today. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. And from this study, what we can gather is that the group of cycling women were naturally just eating the correct amount of fat. And they also happen to have more balanced hormones, generally speaking. And so if we look at, this kind of correlation, eating sufficient fat was correlated with having regular cycles and also having better hormone levels that were generally balanced. And eating the lower fat option was associated with no cycles and really low hormones, like total hormone imbalance. So certainly this study sheds a lot of light on some of the main differences and potentially what we should be focusing on. So a few things I wanted to mention. I mean, in the HA world, the focus is often on having these women eat more. And the focus is often on the psychological aspect of it, where if your main thing is that you're afraid to gain weight and you're really wanting to minimize what you're eating so that you can stay small, then it's almost like a phobia. It's almost like you're afraid of certain foods. Like, so there's certain foods that you're going to label as bad and you're going to want to stay away from those. And so the approach to healing and restoring your cycles and all of that is typically a psychological one. So we want you not to be afraid to eat chips and, all the processed foods, right? And so the focus tends to be on just eating more calories and often more carbs specifically. But when we look at what the research is showing, although that is an important part of recovery, so not saying that it's not an important part of recovery, if we're looking at it, maybe the psychological aspect shouldn't be the sole focus. It shouldn't be the only thing that we're working on. And interestingly, even if it is the psychological focus, maybe the biggest fear is of that to consume. Maybe that is actually the biggest fear. But either way, it does kind of call into question the general approach of just more carbs, more processed foods as the solution to, HA and the main approach to restoring cycling. And maybe we should be looking at the macros. So there was a couple comments by the researchers that I wanted to mention. So I gave the summary. The women who were in the study who were not cycling. So again, this was not exercise related. So these women were not over exercising and they hadn't recently lost a lot of weight. So they didn't fall into these two main categories. However, when they measured the body mass composition and the hormone levels, they did find that they were significantly different to the women who were cycling normally. So the researchers commented that these results are remarkably similar to those that are seen in trained athletes with HA. So although these women in the study were not athletic and they were not over-exercising, the results were very similar as if they had been. And so again, this is kind of the extent of their eating patterns. So they also went on to say that the nutritional deficits may represent a common contributing factor in basically the development of HA. So not necessarily the caloric intake by itself, but what the macronutrient ratio is. So again, this is huge. If we're just telling women who already are overeating carbs and undereating fat to eat more carbs, then it's no surprise that a lot of women are not getting the results that they're looking for. So many women are kind of eating more than they ever have and sometimes not necessarily feeling that great. Sometimes eating tons of processed food leaves your stomach feeling kind of wonky and maybe you're just not feeling as satisfied. Is this really a sustainable way for a lot of women to eat, especially if you think about somebody on that HA spectrum who's really concerned with not gaining weight? Is it a sustainable way to eat, to really eat all the junk all the time? Again, not saying that there isn't value in that kind of exposure therapy, similar to like the phobia stuff where you have to kind of learn that food isn't good or bad. Like eating chips isn't going to kill you. However, if we're looking for sustainability, it can't just be chips, can't just be all of these high calorie processed foods. Those should be consumed every now and then just to make sure that we're not still afraid to eat things. That aspect of it has to be addressed. But what is the sustainable way? And to add another piece to this, there's a lot of different reasons why a person with HA wants to get her period back. Why now? Why are we focusing on this today? One of the most common reasons for many women is because they want to get pregnant. And so they need to get their period back in order to do that. So again, we want to have these women have that balance. They need to have that good foundation of nutrition so that they can feel good and have their bodies be able to sustain a pregnancy and to sustain breastfeeding, and hope to encourage them to not just eat a bunch of stuff to get their period back and have that be the goal, but to overcome this kind of HA mindset so that they can have a future that isn't totally geared around kind of that obsessive focus on weight loss and fear of weight gain and fear of certain foods. How can we support these women to make a more sustainable shift, right? So I think that this conversation is very nuanced. And the trend has been to not really want to talk about that. We don't really want to talk about the quality of the food because we're afraid that these women are then going to develop new unhealthy eating habits. And similar to the fear of telling women the side effects of birth control, I think that we need to be honest about some of these challenges so that when women are looking to overcome their HA, that we can have this nuanced conversation, really understand, what is the research telling us? So one of the final things that the researchers comment is that they say assessment of nutritional intake and intervention to correct imbalances should be considered in the management of these women. So that's, of course, said in kind of a really researchy way, but a more approachable way to say that would be that instead of just looking at this as the simple math equation of calories in, calories out, we need to start looking at the macro ratio, what these women are eating. We have to not just look at, are we eating more calories and encourage them to eat more carbs? If we're looking at what actions are going to make the most significant impact driving them towards their goal of restoring their cycles, it's not just eating more carbs. It is encouraging them to really focus on balancing those macronutrients. Sufficient protein and fat is the foundation of any healthy menstrual cycle, not just women with HA, all of us. We're all humans. And so there are certain things that are similar. And having sufficient protein and fat as a base is essential. And then the carbs can be thrown in as a part of the picture. But I would say that that's essential. And this study certainly shows that. So if you haven't had a chance to, grab a copy of Real Food for Fertility, we dive into this in so much depth. What I've shared with you today is literally one study. And in this chapter, we go through hundreds of studies and share a lot of specific research on this. So the dietary information in Real Food for Fertility it stands on its own. And so what's really useful about the HA chapter, though, is that we go into specific nutritional strategies that are not only geared to support you to get your period back, but we're really focused on doing it in a sustainable way so that you can also feel more confident that you're nourishing your future baby and yourself, so that you can not only just, the goal, I always say, I think I've said this already a couple of times, but the goal shouldn't just be to get your period back. That's not the goal. Like, getting your period back is the beginning of it. That's the starting point in many ways. It's not the end point. Because getting your period back is not the same as maintaining regular cycles and cycling normally and optimally, having optimal hormone balance. Many women with HA can get their cycle back, but then they can kind of go right back to those similar behaviors that got them into HA in the first place. And instead of controlling your food intake to the point that you're not cycling, you could just control it so that you can eat just enough to get that cycle and have it, but not enough to have vibrant health, not enough to have optimal hormone balance and things like that. So you're still seeing short luteal phases, scant mucus, you're still having PMS symptoms, you're still having sometimes cycle irregularities, sometimes ovulation is delayed and that kind of thing, because you're not, and maybe your period's super light, right? And so when you put the pieces together of the picture, you got your cycle back, which is huge. And we definitely need to take a moment to celebrate that. But there's often a lot more work involved in maintenance than you might think. And also the shift in mindset that has to occur from being hyper-focused on losing weight and staying thin. For many women, that's one of the biggest hurdles, which is that in order to get their cycle back, they often do have to gain a little bit of weight. They have to eat more than they ever have or than they ever thought they needed to eat. They have to gain more weight, a little bit more than what they thought. No, it's not necessarily to say that everyone has to gain a ton of weight in order to get their period back. It's, averaging, according to the research, it's sometimes not even that many pounds. But either way, someone who's been really, really focused on maintaining a certain body size, even gaining, 3, 4, 5 pounds can just feel just terrifying. So there's a lot that goes into this. So again, I just stress that spectrum concept so that we can not look at this as black and white and not look at this as a math equation, not look at this as I just have to eat this many calories, because it's just not like that. And hopefully it sheds some light as to why someone may be eating so many calories, but they're still not getting their cycle back because they're not getting the correct macro ratio. So again, for a full deep dive into this whole topic with far more than just this one study, you'll definitely want to check out chapter 12 of Real Food for Fertility, where we really dive into this in the HA chapter. And I think one last piece along those same lines that I just want to highlight. This conversation today has really been focused on macronutrients, because this study showed how the specific reduction or avoidance of fat in and of itself can contribute or cause a person to not menstruate. So even if you're eating similar calories to someone who is cycling normally, if you're specifically avoiding that fat, that plays a big role. But what we haven't addressed, especially for women who've lost their periods for, years, maybe so long periods of time, is that in that context, you have somebody who has been undernourishing themselves for a significant period of time. They may have even been undernourishing themselves before they fully lost their period. If they were on the pill, maybe they didn't even know that they weren't eating enough to have a period, because the pill can mask that, right? So you have somebody who not only is, not getting their period, but there's potentially years of undernourishment. And like I said, often for many women, one of the biggest motivators to get your period back now is because you want to get pregnant, And so are we even talking about those years of undernourishment? Are we just talking about getting your period back, or are we talking about, doing some nutritional testing to see where you're at? Like, what's your iron like? How about your vitamin A, folate, B12, have you tested anything to see where you're at? For women who have been undernourishing for long periods of time, the testing, from my opinion, is not because we don't know that there's if you haven't been eating enough, there's going to be nutritional deficiencies. It's not like a question of, is there going to, there is. But I find the benefit of testing is so that the person can, so that you can see, or your clients can see where they're actually at. It can kind of jolt us into the reality of oh, wow, undernourishing my body for the last several years really left me devoid of nutrients. Even if you were taking a prenatal vitamin or something like that, you may still be surprised at where your levels are at. So the main part of the conversation today has been to balance the macros, which is essential. And that is necessary in order for us to even get a functioning menstrual cycle. But in terms of moving towards optimal fertility and setting yourself up for a healthy pregnancy, healthy baby, and healthy postpartum, and especially if you're wanting to have more than one child and you're wanting to set yourself up for the next pregnancy in the future, we really also have to talk about micronutrient intake. And again, this is part of that nuanced conversation. It could be, a lot of people would have an issue with talking about food quality in the context of HA, because you don't want to create a situation where it's okay, now we're going to have orthorexic tendencies and we're going to try to eat this perfect meal, whatever. But we still have to talk about it. And we still have to ask the question of, okay, so after years of undernourishment, what are we going to do to build those micronutrients as well? And again, Real Food for Fertility has a ton of information on how to do that within the context of really nutritious and delicious meals. So with that said, I want to thank you for tuning in today. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, if you're wanting to take a deeper dive into the study that we talked about today, you can head over to fertilityfriday.com/560. There'll be links there, and you can take a peek at the abstract and have a look at the study if you're wanting to take a deeper dive. And with that said, I hope you have a wonderful weekend, whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting. If you enjoyed today's episode, you're going to love our top resource for women's health professionals, How to Interpret Virtually Any Chart Your Client Throws at You. Our newest ebook breaks down complex chart interpretation into an easy step-by-step process. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/chart to snag your complimentary copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/chart.